Chapter 19 of Skullface by Robert E. Howard. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 19 Dark Fury. The ringed wolf glared the circle round through baleful blue-lit eye. Not unforgetful of his debt, quoth he, I'll do some damage yet, or ere my turn to die. Monday. Like a lean wolf, I glided up the stairs. Some 20 feet up, there was a sort of landing from which other corridors diverged, much like the lower one by which I had come. The thought came to me that the earth below London must be honeycombed with such secret passages, one above the other. Some feet above this landing, the steps halted at a door, and here I hesitated, uncertain as to whether I should chance knocking or not. Even as I meditated, the door began to open. I shrank back against the wall, flattening myself out as much as possible. The door swung wide, and a Moor came through. Only a glimpse I had of the room beyond, out of the corner of my eye, but my unnaturally alert senses registered the fact that the room was empty. And on the instant, before he could turn, I smote the Moor a single deathly blow behind the angle of the jawbone, and he toppled headlong down the stairs, to lie in a crumpled heap on the landing, his limbs tossed grotesquely about. My left hand caught the door as it started to slam shut, and in an instant I was through and standing in the room beyond. As I had thought, there were no occupants of this room. I crossed it swiftly and entered the next. These rooms were furnished in a manner before which the furnishings of the Soho house paled into insignificance. Barbaric, terrible, unholy. These words alone convey some slight idea of the ghastly sights which met my eyes. Skulls, bones, and complete skeletons formed much of the decorations, if such they were. Mummies leered from their cases, and mounted reptiles ranged the walls. Between these sinister relics hung African shields of hide and bamboo, crossed with assegais and war daggers. Here and there reared obscene idols, black and horrific. And in between and scattered about among these evidences of savagery and barbarism were vases, screens, rugs, and hangings of the highest Oriental workmanship, a strange and incongruous effect. I had passed through 2 of these rooms without seeing a human being, when I came to stairs leading upward. Up these I went, several flights, until I came to a door in a ceiling. I wondered if I were still under the earth. Surely the first stairs had led into a house of some sort. I raised the door cautiously. Starlight met my eyes, and I drew myself warily up and out. There I halted. A broad flat roof stretched away on all sides, and beyond its rim on all sides glimmered the lights of London. Just what building I was on I had no idea, but that it was a tall one I could tell, for I seemed to be above most of the lights I saw. Then I saw that I was not alone. Over against the shadows of the ledge that ran around the roof's edge, a great menacing form bulked in the starlight. A pair of eyes glinted at me with a light not wholly sane. The starlight glanced silver from a curving length of steel. Yar Khan, the Afghan killer, fronted me in the silent shadows. A fierce, wild exultation surged over me. Now I could begin to pay the debt I owed Kathulos and all his hellish band. The dope fired my veins and sent waves of inhuman power and dark fury through me. A spring, and I was on my feet in a silent, deathly rush. Yar Khan was a giant, taller and bulkier than I. He held a tulwar, and from the instant I saw him, I knew that he was full of the dope to the use of which he was addicted, heroin. As I came in, he swung his heavy weapon high in the air, but ere he could strike, I seized his sword wrist in an iron grip, and with my free hand drove smashing blows into his midriff. Of that hideous battle, fought in silence above the sleeping city, with only the stars to see, I remember little. I remember tumbling back and forth, locked in a death embrace. I remembered the stiff beard rasping my flesh as his dope-fired eyes gazed wildly into mine. I remember the taste of hot blood in my mouth, the tang of fearful exultation in my soul, the onrushing and upsurging of inhuman strength and fury. God, what a sight for a human eye had anyone looked upon that grim roof where two human leopards, dope maniacs, tore each other to pieces. I remember his arm breaking like rotten wood in my grip and the tulwar falling from his useless hand. Handicapped by a broken arm, the end was inevitable, and with one wild uproaring flood of might, I rushed him to the edge of the roof and bent him backward far out over the ledge. An instant we struggled there. Then I tore loose his hold and hurled him over, and one single shriek came up as he hurtled into the darkness below. I stood upright, arms hurled up toward the stars, a terrible statue of primordial triumph. And down my breast trickled streams of blood from the long wounds left by the Afghan's frantic nails on neck and face. Then I turned with the craft of the maniac. Had no one heard the sound of that battle? My eyes were on the door through which I had come, but a noise made me turn, and for the first time I noticed a small affair like a tower jutting up from the roof. There was no window there, but there was a door, and even as I looked, that door opened, and a huge black form framed itself in the light that streamed from within. Hasim. He stepped out on the roof and closed the door, his shoulders hunched and neck outthrust as he glanced this way and that. I struck him senseless to the roof with one hate-driven smash. I crouched over him, waiting some sign of returning consciousness. Then, away in the sky, close to the horizon, I saw a faint red tint, the rising of the moon. Where in God's name was Gordon? Even as I stood undecided, a strange noise reached me. It was curiously like the droning of many bees. Striding in the direction from which it seemed to come, I crossed the roof and leaned over the edge. A sight nightmarish and incredible met my eyes. Some 20 feet below the level of the roof on which I stood, there was another roof, of the same size and clearly a part of the same building. On one side it was bounded by the wall. On the other 3 sides, a parapet several feet high took the place of a ledge. A great throng of people stood, sat and squatted, close packed on the roof, and without exception they were Negroes. There were hundreds of them, and it was their low-voiced conversation which I had heard. But what held my gaze was that upon which their eyes were fixed. About the center of the roof rose a sort of teocalli some 10 feet high, almost exactly like those found in Mexico and on which the priests of the Aztecs sacrificed human victims. This, allowing for its infinitely smaller scale, was an exact type of those sacrificial pyramids. On the flat top of it was a curiously carved altar, and beside it stood a lank, dusky form whom even the ghastly mask he wore could not disguise to my gaze. Santiago, the Haiti voodoo fetish man. On the altar lay John Gordon, stripped to the waist and bound hand and foot, but conscious. I reeled back from the roof edge, rent in twain by indecision. Even the stimulus of the elixir was not equal to this. Then a sound brought me about to see Hasim struggling dizzily to his knees. I reached him with 2 long strides and ruthlessly smashed him down again. Then I noticed a queer sort of contrivance dangling from his girdle. I bent and examined it. It was a mask similar to that worn by Santiago. Then my mind leapt swift and sudden to a wild, desperate plan, to which my dope-ridden brain seemed not at all wild or desperate. I stepped softly to the tower, and opening the door, peered inward. I saw no one who might need to be silenced, but I saw a long silken robe hanging upon a peg on the wall. The luck of the dope fiend. I snatched it and closed the door again. Hasim showed no signs of consciousness, but I gave him another smash on the chin to make sure, and seizing his mask, hurried to the ledge. A low guttural chant floated up to me, jangling, barbaric, with an undertone of maniacal bloodlust. The Negroes, men and women, were swaying back and forth to the wild rhythm of their death chant. On the teocalli, Santiago stood like a statue of black basalt, facing the east, dagger held high, a wild and terrible sight, naked as he was save for a wide silken girdle and that inhuman mask on his face. The moon thrust a red rim above the eastern horizon, and a faint breeze stirred the great black plumes which nodded above the voodoo man's mask. The chant of the worshippers dropped to a low, sinister whisper. I hurriedly slipped on the death mask, gathered the robe close about me, and prepared for the descent. I was prepared to drop the full distance, being sure in the superb confidence of my insanity that I would land unhurt. But as I climbed over the ledge, I found a steel ladder leading down. Evidently, Hassin, one of the voodoo priests, intended descending this way. So down I went, and in haste, for I knew that the instant the moon's lower rim cleared the city skyline, that motionless dagger would descend into Gordon's breast. Gathering the robe close about me so as to conceal my white skin, I stepped down upon the roof and strode forward through rows of black worshippers who shrank aside to let me through. To the foot of the teocalli I stalked, and up the stairs that ran about it until I stood beside the death altar and marked the dark red stains upon it. Gordon lay on his back, his eyes open, his face drawn and haggard, but his gaze dauntless and unflinching. Santiago's eyes blazed at me through the slits of his mask, but I read no suspicion in his gaze until I reached forward and took the dagger from his hand. He was too much astonished to resist, and the black throng fell suddenly silent. Then he saw my hand was not that of a Negro, it is certain, but he was simply struck speechless with astonishment. Moving swiftly, I cut Gordon's bonds and hauled him erect. Then Santiago with a shriek leapt upon me, shrieked again, and arms flung high, pitched headlong from the teocalli with his own dagger buried to the hilt in his breast. Then the black worshippers were on us with a screech and a roar, leaping on the steps of the teocalli like black leopards in the moonlight, knives flashing, eyes gleaming whitely. I tore mask and robe from me and answered Gordon's exclamation with a wild laugh. I had hoped that by virtue of my disguise I might get us both safely away, but now I was content to die there at his side. He tore a great metal ornament from the altar, and as the attackers came he wielded this. A moment we held them at bay, and then they flowed over us like a black wave. This to me was Valhalla. Knives stung me and blackjack smashed against me, but I laughed and drove my iron fists in straight, steam-hammer smashes that shattered flesh and bone. I saw Gordon's crude weapon rise and fall, and each time a man went down. Skulls shattered and blood splashed, and the dark fury swept over me. Nightmare faces swirled about me, and I was on my knees. Up again, and the faces crumpled before my blows. Through far mists, I seemed to hear a hideous familiar voice raised in imperious command. Gordon was swept away from me, but from the sounds I knew that the work of death still went on. The stars reeled through fogs of blood, but hell's exultation was on me, and I reveled in the dark tide of fury until a darker, deeper tide swept over me, and I knew no more. End of chapter 19.